Good evening, everyone. Sorry for that minor technical glitch. I'm watching the stream. Can everybody actually see me?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Okay. Welcome to the June Rocky Mountain Railroad Club meeting. As usual, for the most part, same rules as every month apply. We're going to keep everybody on mute through the news and the main presenter, and then we'll take some questions at the end. We'll get around to that at the end, but we've got a couple announcements first. Dave and Denny have got a few things, and then of course June means it's grant recipient announcement month, so we'll go through that as well. So Dave, with that, would you like to lead us in?
Sure. Welcome, everybody. This is our June meeting 2021. We had a kind of a club picnic just a few weeks ago that came up on short notice. Some of the club members were able to attend. We would have liked to have had more notice on that, but the opportunity from the Colorado Railroad Museum came up really pretty quick. For those of you that don't know, we had a chance to take part in their weekend when they actually had 3 narrow gauge steam engines all hot at the same time. We don't think that has happened before. This was Denver and Rio Grande Western 491, also 346, and then Rio Grande Southern number 20, which for many, many years had belonged to our Rocky Mountain Railroad Club. And we had wanted to have some sort of a club event last year with the 20 when it was finally back in service after a many million-dollar rebuild. But this was our chance. So we had that, and we had some barbecue, and got to see some people we hadn't seen in a while. The fact that all of us got out of, or all of us that were there got out of quarantine for a little bit was kind of a good thing. I also want to let, one of our newest members that was there, and maybe you can put up a picture of this, Nathan, Carlos Llamas, who has been a longtime engine crew member from the Cumbres and Toltec. He was able to come up for this event. He joined the club, and he got to run 491 a little bit there. First time he had ever run an engine onto a turntable. He said that was an interesting feeling. And I think maybe he got a little bit of throttle time with the 20. On the right side of the screen there, that's Carlos on the 491, and a couple of other museum volunteers. In the middle is Mark Huber, and on the far left is Leighton Moreland. I think maybe now I should let Denny talk before I have any more current events, and or Denny, if you want to, maybe we should let Nathan do the announcements of our Rocky Mountain Railroad Historical Foundation mini grants, whatever you think, Denny.
Well, that sounds good. Welcome everybody to our June meeting, and the telemeetings continue. Hopefully we'll be meeting again in person one of these days. We're working on some plans, and thanks Dave for a good intro, and thanks for everything you did setting this little mini steam up, and we had a good turnout for being as quick as it was. So that was pretty fantastic. We do have, it is a time for grants, and I think that would be most appropriate. Nathan, would you be in a position to announce what the grants were this year?
Sure. Ready to go. Give me 2 seconds here.
Okay.
That's fine. And while he's getting that ready, I'll just let everybody know we had about 90-ish people for our barbecue picnic. Now, 10 or 15 of those people were volunteer steam crew members from the Railroad Museum, because we thought that after running double headers for a long weekend, they probably would be hungry. So the Rocky Club fed the crew. That was a thing that we just decided to do. So
for those who haven't seen the group shot, here's the group of everybody from the club and guests that showed up for the steam picnic. It was it threatened to rain all day, but fortunately the rain stayed off, and it was absolutely a fantastic day at the museum.
Yeah, they didn't run 3 engines simultaneously. For those of you that weren't there, they did double headers a couple of times a day with the 346 and the 20. And for our special run, as you see here, that was the only time all weekend where the 20 was in the lead. and the 346 was in the second position. The 491 mostly stayed around the roundhouse, and people were able to actually, they had some stairs set up for that so people could take a look. And first thing in the morning on Saturday and Sunday, they ran a caboose hop around with each engine sort of as a parade of the 3 engines with a caboose each. So that was as close as they got to running 3 steam engines together. So I know we were going to talk about the grants. Sorry, we digress. This was kind of a special occasion. Yeah.
I figured if I threw these pictures in here, we might as well use them.
Yeah, we're rambling them. Okay,
Yeah.
the picture we're looking at here on the far left is board member Andy Dell. Then I can't remember. Oh, Norm, volunteer Norm is next to him. Me next to the drumhead. Former Rocky Club board member John Charles, and longtime volunteer and conductor out at the Railroad Museum, Al Blount. So anyway.
And of
That is
course, our
incredible
famous
car.
drumhead, Dave.
The famous Rocky Club drumhead that's been on pretty much every club excursion since the late 40s. And it doesn't look as homemade in this view, but when you get up close, it's pretty much homemade. But it has character. So anyway, on with the show, fellas.
Fair enough. In that case, let's talk about the grant program. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the Rocky Mountain Railroad Historical Foundation is the 501c3 charitable arm of the club itself. The grant program was started in 2015 in order to find a new mission, essentially, for the foundation. Back when we used to own equipment, the foundation was largely in charge of fundraising and managing the restoration funds for that equipment. You know, things like RGS 20 that you saw about out of the museum, or Car 25, Denver and Intermountain that we used to own. So when we got rid of all our equipment, because it just wasn't the right home for it anymore, the foundation was sort of left without a mission. So back in 2015, we decided, well, we have this charitable arm that is tasked with railroad preservation. We should use it for something. So we started this grant program. The intention was to use the foundation's name and clout and funds, you know, to look for smaller projects that smaller organizations were doing in the name of railroad preservation. Typically organizations that were a handful of people and didn't have their own fundraising arm and could really use an injection of cash, you know, for small, achievable sort of summer projects. We're not like the Narrow Gauge Preservation Foundation that's going to drop a 6-digit check on you. That's just not us. We're making a difference in small amounts with small projects. That's sort of our mission. The grant has to be used for a railroad-related preservation or educational project. And like I mentioned, it's intended for smaller groups and small to mid-scale projects. Every May, the board gets a selection of grant proposals from groups all over the country, really. I mean, we've had them as far away as the 2-foot gauge in Maine. And the grants are evaluated then on a scale of, you know, on how big the project is it manageable? What's its significance and impact in terms of our stated goals? How relevant is it to the club's sort of target geographic area, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah? I mean, we will consider grants from outside of that, and we have given grants outside of that. But if you're doing something in our sort of home territory, that gets you a few more brownie points.
Yeah.
Also, organizational track record plays in. If we've given you a grant before and you completely screwed it up, we're not giving you another one. If we've given you a grant before and you've done amazing things with it, chances are you're going to get a few more points for next year. Every year we open for applications in January. Generally, there's an announcement. We'll post a PDF on the website that gives all the rules for applying. Applications are usually due at the end of April, so we cut it off May 1st. And then the board will read through them, consider them, vote on them at the May board meeting, and recipients are announced at the June meeting. So our first grant recipient this year is the Teller County Historic and Environmental Coalition. the Shoemaker Ranch up in Teller County was recently sold, and the new owner had this Midland boxcar body that was being used as a storage shed. The coalition wanted, the car was donated to them, but they needed money to both move it from its current site to the old Midland Depot at Divide, and also to do some initial preservation and stabilization work, mostly scraping and painting. So that was project number one. Number two is sort of a perennial recipient of our grants because they keep doing such amazing things with them. The Denver South Park and Pacific Historical Society. For those who don't know, the water tower at Como is currently being rebuilt, what they call phase one. That's the tank base, everything below the actual staves and water storage area. They've gotten donated timbers that are the correct size for the base. They've got a guy with a portable sawmill who's up there right now milling them down. All the permitting is in place. The engineering stamp drawings are there. So, I mean, they're moving forward with this, and it's something we felt we want to support. The tank not only will support the steam operations that Como has been bringing back, but also is critical to getting fire suppression into the roundhouse.
Yeah.
Which, with all the restoration work they've done, it's not something that they should be taking a risk on. So we feel this is incredibly important. It will be a flat top South Park tank, as was at Como up until I think 36, if I remember right. And 36 to 38, it was replaced with the more traditional peaked roof. But they're restoring it as the flat top. The first stage, like I said, is to rebuild the base. They're using the footings that are already there, so they don't have to re-excavate and recast those. And then phase two will actually be constructing the tank on top of it. It'll be a dry tank. The water storage will be 4 large 2,000-gallon polyethylene tanks inside, so they don't have to deal with the constant rot and leaking issues that real water tanks do. The estimated cost of the project is about $70,000. They've raised $42,000 already, and like I mentioned, construction's already underway. Now you've got a couple pictures here. This is actually the Jefferson tank. I cheated. It was the best picture I could find of a flat top South Park tank. And then you've got the drawings and the position next to the roundhouse kind of in the bottom for Como. Our third grant goes to another recipient that we've given money to before. The Pine Elk Creek Improvement Association has this small park up in Pine, Colorado. It's on the old South Park narrow gauge right of way. And a few years ago, we gave them a grant for some interpretive signage to put at the park explaining the significance of the South Park and its history. And they've got these 2 former Rio Grande cars. One's a drop bottom gone, one's a high side gone. The high side gone is actually in pretty good shape. It's been restored and painted. The drop bottom gone less so. Some of the drop bottoms are rotted out and falling out. It desperately needs paint to preserve the wood. And since they did a good job with the first grant we gave them, we decided that it was well worth it to help them save the second piece of equipment. So that's just west of Denver. If anybody wants to go up there and take a look at it, it's right along the highway. Our fourth grant goes to another repeat recipient, although we've not granted the Goose Guys anything in a few years. Galloping Goose Historical Society is based out of Dolores, Colorado. They're the group responsible for both rebuilding the Dolores RGS depot. That is not the original. It's a recreation built by the volunteers of the society, as well as saving RGS 5 and putting it back into service and then running it for usually a couple times a year railfan trips on the RGS on the DNS and Cumbres and Toltec. They've recently acquired 5 freight cars that are sort of representative of those that were found on the RGS. A box car, a high side gone, a drop bottom gone, and 2 stock cars. They've gotten a zoning variation for the area behind the depot and they've constructed a couple of exhibition tracks back there. They're moving the equipment to those tracks, and then they're restoring the equipment and placing an interpretive display around them to sort of explain the history of the RGS, in context. You'll notice in the picture here, there's this sort of sign over here by the switch stands and other maintenance equipment. That was actually what we gave them the last grant for. So these guys do fantastic work. We're happy to help support their efforts. So they'll be getting another $1,000. Mostly that's going to go toward paint and lumber for the cars, because as I'm sure you're all aware, the price of lumber is absolutely through the roof and has completely blown their budget. And then our fifth recipient is a rather interesting project. For those who remember the old passenger car that was shoved in the back of the Durango and Silverton yard for years and years under a tarp. That was Railway Post Office car number 119. 2 years ago, Kyle Colley, who's the son of longtime DNS engineer Bill Colley, and Kyle was a DNS employee in his own right, although Dave, I thought you said he'd moved on to the Grand Canyon, right? Kyle acquired the car with the interest of both stabilizing it, because you can see the condition it's in when it arrived out. I think he's out in Oxford, Colorado. Clearly the car needs some stabilization work, and his goal is to both use it to, preserve it, restore it, and to use it as a vehicle to get younger restoration-minded people into our hobby. Basically, rather than
Bayfield area now.
Is it okay?
Yeah, not far from Durango.
Right.
Rather than all of us arguably graying folks, Kyle's much younger and hangs out with a much younger crowd of railroad enthusiasts, and he's hoping to use the car's restoration to draw more of those people deeper into the restoration community. So at the very least, we think stabilizing it is a fantastic goal, because it's not got a lot of years left as it is. Mike Panel has actually been making new roof ribs for it, so the roof will be stabilized. And then from there, it's just a matter of working on the sides and the underframe. But we think it was worth supporting. So that's our fifth grant recipient for the year. So I always want to throw this in here. People always go, well, the grants are fantastic. And I go, well, here's how you can help.
Right.
We always need donations to pay for them. I mean, obviously, this is a $5,000 outlay every year. And we've been doing pretty good the last few years building up the donation limits to help offset that expenditure every year. But we're still not breaking even on it. So if you're happy with the work we're supporting, we would ask you to consider donating to the Historical Foundation. And bear in mind, it is a 501c3, so you can deduct it on your federal taxes, assuming you're itemizing, of course. The other way you can help that doesn't even involve us is volunteer your time. A lot of these organizations need, boots on the ground as much as they need checks, because we all live in a very busy world, and oftentimes it's hard to get people there when you need them. So, if you're not in a place to write a check right now, go volunteer your time. These organizations will be very happy to have you, I promise. And thirdly, if you can't do any of those, tell someone about our grant program. We can always use the publicity, and it's free for you. So the more we get the word out, the more high quality grant proposals that we get in, and the more effective we can make these grants. So keep that in mind for the next year. And with that, guys, I will turn it back over to Dave.
Okay. I apologize to our presenter. We don't usually keep them hanging this long. We will get to Dr. Holzweiss in just a minute. Nathan mentioned Mike Panel, who has been an amazing restoration resource over the last few years. He's up in southern Wyoming. One thing that he's got going is he's been restoring Denver Tramway car number 04. And actually, he's been doing that for the city of Arvada, Colorado. And I believe they come to his shop tomorrow for the final inspection and the sign off on his restoration. I don't think they're ready to move it down to Arvada yet. I think Mike is going to keep storing it in Wyoming till later, maybe the end of the year, something like that. But he's been doing an amazing job on that. And another connection with the 04 car is it was owned for many years by one of our Rocky Mountain Railroad Club members, Wally Wirt. So there's another coincidental tie in there. I announced last month that UP Union Pacific was going to be taking out the big boy in August. They still have not announced where it's going to go, but I think I can tell you that it's going to probably be out for about 35 days, and I think it's going to go south. And there's also probably going to be a test run sometime in July. As Ed Dickens has told us in the past, they will make the official announcement on, I believe it's the Facebook page called Official Union Pacific Steam Club, something like that. And also, Denny, you may have a couple other things you want to say, and I know we've got an event coming up with the small gauge Colorado Live steamers, if you want to mention that. One of our board members, Steve Suber, has been working on that. So, Denny, what else have you got for us?
That's July 17th, I think, right? Yeah. And then hopefully in August, we're going to have a steam up at Como. So stay tuned. And as we're working with those guys up there, we'll let you know what's happening. But hopefully we're going to have a trip with the drumhead, hopefully again. So I want to thank Nathan and Ron Kaiser for the grant program this year. And it's fun to get these going. And a couple of the little ones I didn't even know existed, and now we're giving to them. So it's kind of good. We did let the beginning of the meeting go on, but there was some stuff. So I'm going to turn it back over. Dave, if you'd like to introduce our guest speaker.
Yes, this month's guest speaker is Bob Holzweiss from Texas. He is the Deputy Director of the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library. And he's going to tell us about the tie-in with this locomotive and that library and the history with our former president. Actually, in my line of work, I work on videos and TV commercials and stuff, and I had worked on a TV commercial with President Bush way back when he was still vice president.
Wow.
And Bob Holzweiss is also the president since 2009 of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society, and they've been around longer than the Rocky Club has. They've been around since about 1921. And I think I've talked long enough, so Bob, please present away.
Thank you, Dave. Thank
Sure.
you, Nathan. And thank you, everyone in the club. And thank you for joining us, especially those of you who are watching live on Facebook. As Dave mentioned, we'll be taking some questions if there are any at the end. And so feel free to chat up. I believe Nathan will be monitoring the chat box so we can do an orderly Q&A at the end. As Dave mentioned, I'm Bob Holzweiss. I'm with the George H.W. Bush Library. We're down here in College Station, Texas, on the campus of Texas A&M University. My first love is railroad history and trains, of course, much like y'all. But my second love and almost equivalent is working at my job. I love the people I work with. I love the work that I do. For those of you who don't know, the Bush Library and George W. Bush and all the other libraries going all the way back to President Hoover are part of the National Archives Presidential Library System. So we're part of a standalone federal agency. I'm in turn a federal employee and work under all the rules and regulations that come along with that, for better or for worse. So a lot of what I'm going to discuss with you tonight is sort of President Bush, a love letter to President Bush. I had no idea he was a rail fan. I wouldn't say he's in the same league as we are or was, but he certainly has an appreciation for railroads and an interest in trains, and was quite supportive of everything that I'm about to describe with you. So give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll get started with the program. There we go. So I'm going to assume that most of you have never been to the Bush Library. If you ever get down here, please feel free to look me up. This is the front entrance of the library. And a little side note, throughout this presentation, you're going to see several images of the locomotive. Most of them were taken by a gentleman named Ken Fitzgerald, working under contract for Union Pacific, and he has granted me permission to share them with you. And several others I kind of grabbed as they came up over the course of the years on the internet, and I've included the name of the photographer on the slide. I'm very particular about giving credit where credit is due, so you'll see those names, and I'll probably call them out to you just to make sure you know it wasn't me. And if there is a photograph by me, you'll recognize it because it's of poor quality, because I'm not a photographer by trade. So today we're going to talk about the SD70 ACE, the 4141. I know what you're thinking. We're going to do a whole talk about one locomotive. Yes, we are, but it's sort of the history of the locomotive from inception to retirement, and now more recently to placement at the George Bush Library. Welcome to the program. So you're looking at a CSX locomotive that is photographed by me, note the quality, back in 1992. And you may wonder to yourself, what the heck are we starting here for? Well, the truth is, back in 92, I was an intern at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. And during my first summer there, the Railroad Museum and CSX cooperated to bring this locomotive in. And you'll notice it's called the Spirit of Maryland. It's a named locomotive. And I was blown away by the amount of publicity this generated for the museum and goodwill it generated in the community. This Bill Hakkarainen shot, he was a volunteer, Dr. Bill Hakkarainen, with me at the library. This is after they placed the locomotive inside, and the attendance was, through the roof. People wanted to see it. They wanted to have people talk about it, and CSX was delighted to do it. And at that moment, I filed away in my head this idea that at some point in the future, we may have an opportunity, wherever it may be, and I wasn't working at the library yet, I was still in graduate school, to do something like this in order to generate publicity. How important was it to the railroad? You'll notice that this is wearing the second CSX paint scheme, sometimes derisively referred to as the Dark Future scheme, and they still call it the Spirit of Maryland. So apparently this naming had value to the railroad as well. And this again reinforced my thinking about this project. And this is a Larry Burford photo from down in around Florida. So what happened? Fast forward to about 2003, 2004. I'm at the Bush Library. I'm working in the archival department at the time. And my boss, the director, and the director of the foundation, Bush Foundation, came to me and several employees and said, we've been open for about 5 years. We opened in 1997. And the local population of Bryan College Station thinks they've been there, they've done that. And why should we go back to the museum? And we have a temporary gallery. It's about 2,800 square feet, plus a long hallway that we also call a secondary temporary gallery. And they asked for ideas from the staff about what kind of exhibit we could put in there to kind of boost interest in the library and sort of a second grand opening of the library. So I submitted my proposal because of my interest, and it was chosen. I was a little bit surprised and somewhat humbled to do what became Trains, Tracks of the Iron Horse. It ran from November of 2005 until July of 2006. We did a lot of things. The foundation was extraordinarily generous, and Union Pacific was our gold sponsor, our prime sponsor of the exhibit. And their generosity, I will be recognizing it throughout the talk, but their generosity began there and continues to this day. So I want to specifically thank the folks at Union Pacific for all the help that they provided. This was the logo we designed for the exhibit based on, if you probably recognize the shape of the locomotive, if you've been to be in a museum, the C&O 590 streamlined Hudson, that's where that came from. I don't want to bore you with the details of the exhibit, but give you a flavor of what it was like. We had about 1,800 artifacts borrowed from both private vendors or private collectors and museums. This is just happens to be one case. We talked about all dimensions of the railroading industry. I was the primary author of the exhibit and selected most of the artifacts. This is one case. It was all told about 3,800 square feet of information for folks, plus a live feed to rail cams, which were back then really in their infancy. I was privileged to work with Brian Marsh at Overland Models, and he was able to provide us with some fantastic models that we displayed. You'll see this is the case in that long hallway, the Fidelity Corridor, we call it. I've taken many pictures, but I won't bore you with them. These were provided by him on loan and installed by him. He was kind enough to come down and join us for a week to put this together. We also went big, you know, it's Texas, right? So you go big or you go home. And so we went to the what was then the Texas State Railroad up in Palestine, which is about 90 minutes from us. They had a caboose in the back that had been pushed sort of into the weeds, very much like the RPO car that's being restored that you mentioned in your earlier remarks about your charitable work. And we asked them if we could borrow it and put it in our parking lot. And it was in rather sad shape. It's actually, this is, if you recognize the number, this is actually a former Rock Island caboose that went to the Union Pacific when the Rock Island went under. The Palestine car shop, soon to close, of Union Pacific was right at the end of track of the museum, and they agreed, thanks to Union Pacific's cooperation, to repaint that caboose, sandblast it, repaint it into a more contemporary Union Pacific scheme. Obviously, when it was in service, Building America was not the corporate logo, but it is now. So they shipped it down here. We trucked it over, and here it is being placed on its wheels in our parking lot of the museum. It was probably the best signage I could think of, short of getting a locomotive, that people could see from the highway, which is sort of in back of the crane in this photo. So President Bush, as I mentioned, was definitely a fan of railroads. I wouldn't say he was a rail fan. And we invited him in to take a look at the exhibit. Of course, he approved of it. The gentleman with him, you probably recognize, is former Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. There was an event, and Mr. Hastert decided to join him for the tour. The lady with her back to us is my former boss, Patricia Birchfield, who at the time was the curator, now retired. Now I'm actually in her old position as deputy director. What they're looking at over on the left side of the screen is Frank Sinatra's personal Lionel collection. Some of the stuff was quite phenomenal, and his estate was very kind to let us borrow just about whatever we wanted. And sort of the highlight of the exhibit was we were able to borrow the golden spike from Stanford University for a period of 1 month and put it on display. And I must admit, the case that they made us build for it was probably worth more than the gold in the golden spike, but that's a story for another time. You'll notice that pink engine in the case. That was a very special engine for Mr. Sinatra, because pink, of course, is cancer awareness, the color of cancer awareness. We also did a public art project. Again, this was an all-in exhibit, go big, go big or go home. And President Bush actually purchased one of 41, since he was the 41st president, fiberglass model steam engines. And this one was decorated by us and put in our rotunda of our museum, and he kindly signed it. And here's a photo of him signing it. The other 40 of them were distributed around town to businesses that were our sponsors for the exhibit. And for that, they were able to pay a fee to us. We'd provide the locomotive. They could paint it however they saw fit and put it on display in front of their business to show their support for our museum. There's a couple that are still around town. One of them is the Hot and Ready Express by Little Caesars. I'm a fan of Little Caesars, so I see it every time I go. Here's the group cutting the ribbon. The gentleman over on the far left and the lady next to him, that's Richard Davidson, who at the time was president and CEO of Union Pacific and was really sort of the moving force behind getting the locomotive, which we'll be getting to in a minute. The gentleman on the far right, you might recognize as Robert Gates, former head of the CIA, and at the time, the president of Texas A&M University. So it was quite a group of people that were joining us for the ribbon cutting. In back of them is a mock-up of a full-scale mock-up of a UP office car that we set up so people could get up there and take a picture in front of the drumhead, which is unfortunately obscured in this picture. So you could actually get up on the platform and have a photo made like you're a celebrity on the back of a premier passenger train. Okay, this brings us to the locomotive. So this is the 4141, a Michael Johansson photo. You could tell it's probably up in the Puget Sound area of Washington. My initial idea, recall back in the first slide at the B&O Museum, was to take a locomotive, an existing locomotive, and repaint it or decorate it in a way that would promote the exhibit and perhaps the museum. So since there was a 4141 already, it made sense to target that locomotive. This is my initial concept, and please excuse the rather weak Photoshop job that I did. The model was provided by Overland. The graphics were done by me. I didn't have enough courage to ask Union Pacific to paint that locomotive anything other than yellow, because that's just not something they did back at the time. And so I thought it would be neat to do something like the Spirit of Texas, a kind of a takeoff on the theme of the American flag that they started putting on after 9/11, and then put it small graphics promoting the museum and bigger numbers promoting 41, Bush 41. So this is my initial concept. So when we went to Omaha to visit with Mr. Davidson, I brought this model with us. We sat down in his office. We discussed it. He was extraordinarily supportive and said, well, my people will take care of it. We'll get back to you. And this is what they came up with. So it's quite a bit different than what my initial concept was. The company that they engaged to do this is Bailey Lauerman, which at the time was their public relations firm that they worked with on a fairly regular basis. You might recognize those colors are the colors of Air Force One. The interesting part about that is the original Air Force One paint scheme was developed by President Kennedy in conjunction with a gentleman named Raymond Loewy, whose name you're probably familiar with as an industrial designer who cut his teeth and became famous in part designing railroad equipment. And so he actually worked with President Kennedy on the Air Force One paint scheme. I have the documents from the Kennedy Library that exchanged correspondence between the two and the finalization of what we see today. So this is really coming full circle, taking Raymond Loewy's concept for a plane and putting it on a train, since that's where he got his start. So this is what they came up with. This is what Union Pacific did. They actually had the locomotive painted offline in Horicon, Wisconsin by the Wisconsin and Southern. They're quite talented crew up there. And in order to sort of throw the rail fan and rail historian community off the scent, they put a blue tarp on it, and it was actually labeled UP 4123. So if you really had to be in the know to know what was going on, this is on its way down to Texas. You could see the Wisconsin and Southern business car. That's where UP maintenance and mechanical people rode with it on the way down to Texas. No, they did not use the original 4141, although that would have been an interesting take on my idea. So here we go. On November 19th, 2005, UP wanted to make a really splashy dedication. So they built a building, they laid track, and they brought the locomotive to Texas. They put the locomotive in, they untarped it, spent a day prepping, and then they had about 200 invited guests in this building that they built in a parking lot, actually at Texas A&M University, where they normally park buses. They invited President and Mrs. Bush, and they were absolutely blown away. And here's, I affectionately call him the boss, the president, in the cab, giving him the traditional gig 'em sign, which is a Texas A&M way of saying good job. We had the little smoke. It was quite a production, lights, camera, action kind of thing. If you're into that kind of TV glitzy reveals, it was really something to behold. So here's the locomotive, brand new showroom floor, less than 20 miles on the odometer, ready to go into service. But before it goes into service, we're going to do a couple other things. So President Bush, of course, was a man of action, a man who wanted to get his hands into things. So he wanted to take it out for a spin. The next day after that previous photo, he decided that he wanted to take his locomotive, his words, out for a little ride. And of course, to be a locomotive engineer, you need a license. Now, President Bush did not have a license. And so you'll notice that he's sitting in the engineer's seat with his hand on the throttle. So when you're the president, you have special privileges that come with that job. This is not my photo, by the way. I was supposed to be aboard this trip, but because of Secret Service and UP mechanical people, I got bumped off. So I was left to be a traditional rail fan chaser of this journey. The president did quite well. He loves leaning on the horn. I don't think there were many railroad crossings in his path, but I heard the horn the whole way. So he was having a blast and brought it to a really nice stop right where he was supposed to. A lot of the students on campus, because here at A&M, the tracks bisect the campus. I was standing next to some of them when the gates go down, and I could see them shaking their heads saying, I'm going to be late for class. Here's another train coming. And they look up, and there's President Bush hanging out the window, waving to them, and they're pointing at him going, what in the world is going on here? So he had a great time. They had a great time. There were smiles all around. Once President Bush departed, UP immediately put this locomotive on display, public display outside, across from the football stadium. Since it was the fall, the football games were still going to be going on, and they wanted to get maximum attention on the locomotive. Of course, they had 24-hour security on site. In back of me in this photograph is the Student Rec Center. So the entire student body of A&M, which at the time was about 60,000, now it's approaching 70, would pass by this locomotive at one point or another during the week. So it was great positioning. The main line is right there in the back. After it was on display, this is a Ken Fitzgerald shot, by the way. UP asked us, or didn't ask us, they told us that they would put it in service between Dallas and Houston on FWHO and HOFW, the Fort Worth to Houston and Houston to Fort Worth train. I was a little surprised, and quite pleasantly so, when they paired it up with what their then new heritage units, the Katy unit and the Mopac unit. This is a picture well north of Bryan College Station. I understand, perhaps this is apocryphal, that the orders, standing orders, were the 4141 always had to be in the lead. I spent a lot of time trackside. I never saw it in a trailing position. So I imagine that they followed the orders pretty carefully, and it was turned at each terminal between runs. The Katy unit always seemed to be in the middle, although it was pointed in different directions depending on the day of the week you saw it. So here it is passing A&M. Now, Kyle Field is our football stadium. It looks a lot different now. That west bleachers with the big Kyle Field on it was since dynamited and replaced by an even larger structure. That stadium now seats 111,000 people, which makes it one of the largest in the country and the largest in Texas. The main line, as I mentioned, bisects the campus. Here are the three amigos, as the railfan community used to call them. That black spot of dirt in the foreground is where the locomotive was displayed in that previous photo. And so this lasted for about 2 months, back and forth. It allowed me to get some great pictures, and a lot of people from quite far away who had an interest in trains came down. If you search railpictures.net or any of your favorite rail photo databases, you probably come up with several hundred images from this period of time. So then the locomotive went into general service all across the UP system, promoting both the library and the exhibit, but mostly the library. And then in 2012, UP pulled it out of service. President Bush had a health scare. You may recall he was in the hospital for several weeks, and there was some talk about him not making it. And UP at the time was putting together their plan for the funeral train, which would be the first funeral train since Eisenhower. A little aside, President Bush was very much interested in the arrangements for after he passed away. He would work on them on a fairly regular basis. His staff was well versed in his wishes. There were plans and plans and plans. There was about 3 inches of plans if you put the papers down on top of each other. And a central part of the plan was his final trip would be from Houston to College Station by train with the 4141 in the lead. I like this shot, which is from Jim Dowdy. It's at the Jenks shop in Little Rock, which is where the locomotive went into storage in 2012, because it actually shows a kind of a compare and contrast. If you can imagine that paint scheme on the SD70 next to it, that was what my original concept would have been. It just so happened it didn't work out. I much prefer the way the UP chose to do it. The locomotive sat there for several years, sometimes covered, sometimes not. They would take it out and run it about once a month on a local just to stretch its legs and make sure it was in good shape. And so there it was. And ironically, or not ironically, but somewhat interestingly, that's about 5 miles away from the William J. Clinton Library. You can't quite see it from the library, but it's certainly close by. It's on the other side of the Arkansas River. That brings us to the sad part. President Bush, of course, passed in November of 2018. Union Pacific immediately executed the plan for the funeral train. I have hundreds of incredible images of people coming out to pay their respects to President Bush during his final journey. I particularly like this one, which is down near Tomball, Texas, because of the giant American flag provided by the local fire department. You can see how close people were standing to the tracks. This is something UP and the Secret Service were quite worried about because of what happened during the RFK funeral train. You recall that several people were killed when they got hit by an opposing movement. And so Union Pacific did their due diligence. They really went the extra mile, and there was no injuries, no errors, and the train arrived within 30 seconds of its scheduled arrival in College Station, which is truly an amazing feat. Oh, and incidentally, The engineer and the fireman on that train, June and Randy, are both Navy veterans, like President Bush was. They were specially picked for this run because of their service to the United States. So it just, from beginning to end, it's a class operation, very class operation. Another class operation is this. This was probably the most secret part of the funeral train. I was sworn to secrecy that UP would create a baggage car with a clear plastic door on it. So when he proceeded past on the train, mourners could actually see the coffin in the train, something that was not possible when President Eisenhower was transported from Washington to Abilene, Kansas on a baggage car. So this baggage car was extremely close hold by Union Pacific. I never saw it come out of storage between 2012 and then when it was needed. So there's President Bush's casket, of course, guarded by, in this case, I believe it's an Army, enlisted man in the Army, as it proceeds through Navasota, Texas. This is another Ken Fitzgerald shot. You can see the people in the balconies and in the buildings in the background and along the right of way. It was everywhere. It was amazing. Here it is arriving in College Station, Texas. The folks down on the lower right screen are the Texas A&M Corps of Cadets, Aggie Fighting Texas Aggie Band, that greeted the president with "Hail to the Chief." And then you could see across the street, probably 2,000 or 3,000 people lined up along the road, welcoming the president home for the final time. This group here is an elite group of I don't know if they're freshmen. They're called the Ross Volunteers, members of the Texas A&M Corps of Cadets. They stood in this position in the rain, in the cold rain. It was probably about 45 degrees that day for about an hour. I didn't see any of them move an inch, waiting for President Bush to arrive. And there's the locomotive, of course, in the background. At the conclusion of that process, the locomotive and the train were pulled down the track to a place called CPQ 75 on the Navasota subdivision, so the Secret Service could collect all their gear. You'll notice in the center middle of the locomotive, those little antennas that are sticking up, those were added specifically for this trip so the Secret Service could communicate from the locomotive back to the train. And those were not within clearance limitations going forward. So they had to spend about 2 hours collecting all their gear and making sure the train could meet clearances on its trip back north. This is an Alan Williams shot. There was probably about 20 photographers at this location, including myself. But as I mentioned, my photographic skills leave much to be desired. So I'm going to let the pros speak for this one. And so thank you, Alan, for this wonderful shot. Now we're back into a more happy time. UP expressed a desire to donate the locomotive to us. And of course, they did it in style. They added it to the last tour of the 4014 when it arrived in Houston, Texas in November of 2019. And it rode shotgun with the 4014 from Houston to College Station, just like President Bush in his final ride. Here it is pulling into the dedication site. Here's Mr. Davidson. Looks like he hasn't aged a bit. I had a privilege of speaking with him aboard the train on the way up, and we just had a lot of laughs, shared a lot of memories, and I thanked him profusely for the generosity of Union Pacific. And he's quite a guy, and it was just delightful to visit with him briefly. And there, of course, is a locomotive in the back. So after that, the locomotive, the 4141 and the 4014 proceeded to Palestine, which is just up the line, 90 minutes away, where the 4141 was cut out of the train and then brought for preparation for the donation. And when I say preparation, I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And here's the last shot of the two of them together. This is another Ken Fitzgerald shot. He was invited by Ed Dickens to ride the cab of the 4014 for this trip. So he was able to get a lot of really good movement shots, and he was kind enough to provide me with this one. All right, so now that the locomotive is donated, now we have to figure out a spot for it. This is the actual library. This is sort of the backside of the library. That open field to the left is where the locomotive will go. You'll see up on the right in the dark side of the building, those two windows, there'll be some photos you'll see of the site from those windows taken by me later on in this presentation. Here's the first one looking down at the site. This is when March 3rd, about 3 months ago. And we're prepping the site for the receipt of the locomotive. Here's a heavy haul company. This is J. Super and Son. They're based in New Jersey. You may have heard of them before because they were the company employed to fish Sully's plane out of the Hudson River after it crashed, and their reputation preceded them. Let's put it that way. These guys, total pros from beginning to end. Again, the plan was an inch thick, and everyone knew exactly their role and what they were doing. Here they are setting up at the library. We'll get back to that in a minute. On March 21st was the move day. This is the trailer they brought up from Houston. It doesn't look like much, but it actually has 96 independent wheels on it that all turn independently. It's hydraulic. Every wheel set can be raised and lowered independently to keep the load balanced over the most uneven ground. And believe it or not, they weren't going to remove the trucks. They were going to set the whole locomotive, trucks and all, on this trailer, chain it down, and drive it over. And so here we go. This is the hydraulic connections, and this trailer is modular, so you could subtract units and add units to it. It's really an amazing piece of equipment. And this happens to be where the rails were. You could see them on the top of the screen. This tractor has very low horsepower. It's only about 400 horsepower, but it's also extremely low geared and very heavy. So it was going to be a very low speed trip, but not a very fast trip. You'll notice in the very background where the crossing gates are, there's a slight hill there. There was some concern that the trailer would not, or the tractor wouldn't get it up over the hill. At least I was concerned, they weren't. Or that the trailer would bottom out going up, but because of the hydraulics, they were able to clear it without any problem at all. Of course, a class operation from beginning to end. The engineer and conductor who handled President Bush's funeral train, they handled the delivery of the 4141, and it was towed by the 1943, the Spirit of Union Pacific, the Veterans Tribute locomotive. Here's the 4141 itself. The engine, the traction motors, and a lot of the internal gear had been removed to lower the weight, but also because it's a very low mileage locomotive, and the SD70 ACEs are still in service. So UP was able to use those components to change out with other locomotives. It was painted again, touched up on the top deck, but painted on the lower deck, and really cleaned up nice. And the wheels are dummy wheels. There's no traction motors on there. So it lowered the weight to about 160 tons, which is still a lot, but certainly less than what it would weigh fully provisioned. The contractor bought two of these. These are 250-ton cranes, mobile cranes. Union Pacific kept traffic moving as the setup continued. I won't bore you with all that. The cranes, of course, some assembly required, all the counterweights and all that. Here we are getting ready to lift, and the trailer's in position. You'll notice there's a train coming down, what they call main number 2. It was the last train that was going to pass us before we actually did the lift. I say we. I was a passive observer on this. Let me be clear of that. Mostly with the camera in my hand, with Ken Fitzgerald near me. The real pros on this are the J Super folks and the Union Pacific folks who really made this all happen. Now we're ready. We're getting ready. And as I tell people all the time, if you've never seen a locomotive fly, you have now. And I frankly was aware of the lifting points on a locomotive, but I'd never seen them used. And they're being used right here. Perfectly, actually. The whole locomotive weight's being supported by those 4 points. The trucks are actually chained temporarily to the frame to prevent them from falling off when they picked it up off the track. Here's a better shot. The folks with the orange vests are Union Pacific. Even they have their cameras out. And the folks in the green vests are J Super folks. Here we are backing out, and the driver of this truck, I got to give him a lot of credit. He was quite a character to talk to, but also an absolute pro with the driving. And you can see the wheels kind of articulating on the trailer. There was one little hiccup here, which I'll get to here. You'll see on the top left, there's a guy up in a bucket truck with a rope attached to the traffic signal. The initial plan was to disconnect that post and just kind of move it away, but the bolts were rusted. So instead of disconnecting it, they put a strap on it and then used the bucket to sort of force it up to get over the locomotive. I was waiting for it to snap, but luckily it never did. And they had to pivot the traffic light pointing up to make the clearance. It cleared by about 18 inches, so there was plenty of space. Here's the locomotive coming to the library. You probably remember my first slide, a sort of an early morning shot of the library. This is out further away in the parking lot, about where the caboose was displayed. This is another Ken Fitzgerald shot of them pulling in. I was up on the roof of the library, so Ken's actually behind the locomotive in this image, and I'm up on the roof getting the shot. And now, and no laughs, please, but this is why a cell phone camera doesn't work well for long distance photography with me operating it. Here it is pulling in the loading dock where we're going to secure it for the evening, and here it is tied down for the evening. Now I'd like to take a brief, well, actually, let's do this. The next day, we're ready to go first thing in the morning to position the locomotive and get it ready to put on its new and permanent home. Here we are pulling into position. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a different let's do this. This is a time lapse from that photo that I just showed you. I want to show you this time lapse of how they did it. It's a little over 4 minutes. These shots were taken from the upper roof corner of the library at 2-second intervals. You could see these guys move around like ants, but they all have a role. They all have a purpose. They all know what they're doing. The gantries that you see, they're actually erecting a second gantry in the back. Those are 400-ton capacity gantries, so each. So there's really no problem with the lift. The lift itself was sort of anticlimactic after watching all of the setup that was required. And by the credit again, where credit is due, this is a Ken Fitzgerald GoPro that was snapping these photos, and then he produced the video afterwards. The action will pick up here in a moment when they get that rear crane going. You see that gentleman on the lift in the front, there was some clearance issues on the slides on top of the gantry, and he had a grinder out there grinding it down in order to make sure they had the exact tolerances that they needed. They were taking no chances with this project. Now we're approaching the moment of truth. Once they get the rear hooked up, it'll go pretty fast. Positioning was everything. These guys were absolutely perfect. Level, exact distance from the front of the track. It was all textbook. The whole move of the locomotive off the trailer took about 15 minutes. So that is that. Now I want to return back to where we were earlier. Dave, can you give me a thumbs up? You can see that? Okay. We don't have much more to go. I appreciate your patience. So this is sort of leading into that. These are Ken Fitzgerald shots. I won't belabor the point anymore, but these are a little bit of interior in the zone shots. And this is just prior to the lift. This gentleman right here is the person responsible for operating those gantry cranes. And you can see he's carrying a remote control in his hand. It's actually a pretty simple device. I was a little surprised by it. And the red button, of course, is the abort button. And he was dead serious when he was doing this work. Really absolute, again, pro from beginning to end. And here he is. Notice the zone has been cleared of all people in case there is an accident. There wasn't, but there he is doing his thing. This gentleman right here was the construction boss, and he is taking great pride in great precision in what he's doing as they place the locomotive down on the tracks. And there they are measuring it up in the front. And this is something I had to have a picture of because no one would believe me if you didn't see it for yourself. Under the front left wheel, there is a 2021 penny for good luck. If you really got down there and looked at it really close, you could see it. But this is proof positive that that really is there. And there it is. And here it is. This is after the tarp was taken off. Since this photo, you could see the banding around the bottom. It has been rewrapped in a shrink wrap because we're building a building around it. And we don't want the locomotive. This item is so large, it has to be the first thing that goes there. Then you build a building around it rather than the other way around. And so this is before and this is after. So far, so good, except the shrink wrap now. People are disappointed. The main road into the library is at the top of the screen right there. So people drive by this big, it looks like a beached whale in the front yard of the library, but it's not, it's gray. This is a little hard to see. I apologize. This is an engineering drawing of the positioning of the locomotive. This is Barbara Bush Drive is our main entry right here. Locomotive is right there. This is the archable wing. The museum is off the top of the screen. Our main entrance is right here into this part of the building. We're building a plaza down through where the 80 is on the screen, down in here, because we're going to be doing, it'll look like this when we're done. You'll notice in the back here, there's something else. So this is going to be a three-part process. The locomotive is phase one. This is a totally enclosed pavilion with a Marine One, HMX-1 helicopter. We're also getting a TBM Avenger airplane, and there'll be a restaurant associated. We do not right now have a restaurant associated with it. This plaza, if you walk down out the lower right-hand corner of the screen, will lead to the front entrance of the library. The artist rendition, the weather is always so nice. I wish it was true in real life. Here's it. This phase two arrives in October of this year. This is not the HMX-1 we're getting. It will look very similar to this, though. There is one that was never reconfigured from when President Bush flew in it. That's the one we're getting. So it's going to look, the interior will look just like it looked when he flew on it. Here's the TBM Avenger. This is the TBM Avenger we're getting. It's currently at the Marine Corps Museum in San Diego, California. They're deaccessioning it. This one, we already have one. If you've been to the library, you probably remember it's hanging from the ceiling. The one we have is a Grumman TBM, which is the type that was flown by President Bush. He was shot down, of course, so it's not his plane. This one is a General Motors TBM. The problem we have with the display, the display we have right now is very dramatic. It's hanging from the ceiling, but you really can't see it up close. This one will be put in that pavilion so you can see it up close and maybe perhaps even look in the cockpit. We'll see. And that concludes, that's the rear of the library, by the way, down by the pond. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. But before I do, Dave said I could put a little pitch in for the RMRRC, which is my organization. Let me pull that up here real quick, that I am president of, that he mentioned in the opening remarks. I'll share my screen again. This is our website, rllhs.org. If you're interested, this is we're celebrating our 100th year anniversary. Of course, there's the 4014. So it's a it closes the circle on the presentation. I'm actually hosting the annual meeting here in Bryan College Station in October. There's a lot of information here. I don't want to bore you with it, but if you are interested, we do online memberships. We have about 2,200 members. We publish railroad history twice a year. This is the most recent issue, and you can scroll down and see the content. We are an equal opportunity railroad history organization. We don't focus on any particular railroad. About once every 10 years, we do a Canadian or Mexican issue. We are international. About 5% of our members are from around the world. So if you're into railroad history writ large, we're the organization for you. So thanks for letting me put in that little plug, Dave.
Oh, you bet, especially on your 100th year.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. It is amazing that we've lasted, and congratulations, by the way, on the success of your club for so long. It's hard to sustain a volunteer organization for that length of time.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So Bob has said that if we have some questions, I think Nathan can arrange to let people unmute themselves if you want to. And I'm not sure if we have any that have been typed in on the chat or maybe via YouTube. If Nathan's juggling several different monitors here, so we'll have to see if he has time for all that. But do we have some questions?
I have not seen any questions come in on chat, but yeah, I've as usual. I mean, it's a fairly small crowd tonight, so this shouldn't be too challenging. But if you unmute yourself, ask your question, and go back on mute, that helps cut down on the noise. So have at it, folks.
Will the building be fully enclosed or open is the question. And the answer is, right now the plan is for partially. It'll be 3 sides, east, south, and north side, with an open side facing that road where people drive in. I think, and this is kind of speculation on my part, ultimately it will be totally enclosed to protect the paint job, because the western sun in Texas, well, the western sun anywhere in the evening, is very harsh on paint. And I think after a period of time, it will become obvious to us that closing it in would be to our best interest. So yes, ultimately I think it will, but initially it will not be. And the one thing I failed to add, which is not obvious in that artist rendition, the side facing the road, you'll be able to walk up to it at track level, and where you'll be able to see the trucks and the wheels. On the back side, where with the enclosed side, you'll be able to walk up at the level of the running board, the deck, and look in the cab window from that side. So you get 2 different perspectives on the locomotive, and of course all ADA compliant. So there'll be ramps, not stairs, everywhere you go.
So probably now is the time to get some pictures before more structures are built around it.
That's correct, except it's wrapped. And if you want a picture of a gray whale sitting on a piece of grass, and it's a little bit disappointing, but I certainly understand the reasoning behind it. And the wrapping is actually vented, so it doesn't stick. And there's a doorway, looks like a tent. You unzip it, and you can go in there and inspect the locomotive from time to time to make sure everything is in good order.
Have they said when the whale wrap might come off, or does that wait for the completion of the building?
Well, at least for the completion of the walkway, because that's when the dirt gets moved and the dust flies and the rocks and all that stuff. So it's going to be several months. It won't be ready by the time we have our meeting in October, unfortunately.
I bet you still have a lot of people come look.
We do have a lot of people come look. They do a lot of drive-bys, and they wonder to themselves if that's actually it, because you can't tell. It's wrapped so tightly, and there really is nothing like it on the ground. So yes, it is it.
Anything Other questions?
Else? You can chat me up, or you can unmute, or whatever. Well, if there is no more questions, then I appreciate your time, and I want to thank you all for joining me, and thanks to everyone on Facebook who's watching without being able to ask questions. So,
Or YouTube, I think it is. Yeah.
oh, YouTube, excuse me.
Yeah.
We
yeah.
do Facebook Live. You do YouTube Live. Okay. And so thanks for having me. I know it's just one locomotive, but it's an interesting story, and I love telling it. And hopefully you'll be able to get down here at some point. Not recently, not in the near future. Perhaps this time next year would be a good time to visit. The fall is always good, especially if you're a football fan. The games are definitely something to behold. Even if our team is not winning, it's an experience that you will not soon forget.
Penny, did you have a comment?
I think, did we have Mike, do you have a comment? I saw a hand go up, but
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Mike raised his hand. Yeah.
Raised his hand. Can you unmute yourself, Mike?
That was supposed to be a clap.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
high five.
Well, you know, we have quite a variety of different presenters and presentations, but there's nothing quite like this one, because I can't think of another tie-in with a railroad or a locomotive with a president or presidential library like this. This is a pretty unique story, and I think you've given us a great look at it for sure.
Thank you, Dave. And it's a privilege to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we're glad to have you be able to do this from long distance. This is the silver lining to the fact that we can't do our meetings in person. We at least can tap into some people from far away.
Thank you.
If we don't have any other questions, as far as upcoming shows, I usually will announce who we've got for presenters coming up. Still tossing around a couple of things for the next couple of months, folks, so I don't have anything to announce yet for July, August, and beyond. There's a lot going on in STEAM, especially in Colorado, coming up in August. You know, Como's going to try and have STEAM. Durango's got some special trains. The folks down at the Cumberson Toltec in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado have a lot of things going on there. Victorian special weeks with pre-1900 engines and cars. There's going to be a lot going on there. So
The end of August. Yeah.
Lots of things going on, not to mention probably a 35-day road trip for the UP 4014 Big Boy. Who knows, Bob? Maybe they'll come down your way in time for the RNLHS convention. I know they're playing it close to the vest, but if they're going south, you never know. It could come your way again.
They have to come pretty far south to get to me. There's a lot of between me and them.
Right. Well,
I hope. I'm not banking on it, but you never know.
You never know. I think they'll make that announcement pretty soon. All right then. Denny, did you have anything else?
No, except to thank Bob. Great presentation, and nice honor for our departed president, and we sure appreciate your time to share with the club. So thanks again.
Thank you, Denny. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me again. Gentlemen
Okay.
and ladies, thank you.
All right. Oh, yeah. Speaking of ladies, I wanted to mention that our member Linda Fike is one of the people that suggested getting in touch with you for this show. She was living up here up until a year or two ago, and now she has moved back to Texas. But I think she was the one that sort of planted the idea with me that I should get in touch with you. So, thank you, Linda.
Well, she's out there. She's watching on YouTube.
Probably so. Yep.
She texted me earlier and said she'd be monitoring my talk. So thank you, Linda. I know you're out there.
This one's for Linda. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, she'll take care of you.
So thanks. I know Nathan's going to wrap this up. John Scott, if you would hang on and stick around for us while he turns off the live feed, we'll talk to you soon. And everybody else, thanks for tuning in to the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club.
Thank you all again. Have a great evening.
Yep.
Not at all. Thank you.